Welcome to a special presentation here on Gospel Preaching with Chris Peltz. My name is Chris Peltz, and I am the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ in Springfield, Missouri. And joining me today is a special guest, Mark Cascairo, who has been teaching a class on the book of Revelation, but from a very particular and special perspective. And it was such an amazing class, an awesome class, that I wanted to have him join me. And we're going to do a two-part series here on this program talking about the book of Revelation, because it is probably one of the most misunderstood books, misapplied books, and one of the most intimidating books for a lot of people. And too often, the wrong people are looking at the book of Revelation to draw conclusions. And the people that need to understand the book of Revelation stay away from it because I think of that intimidation factor, and they're afraid to look at it. They don't want to look at it, and they think it can't be understood. But the great thing about what Mark has done in putting this class together, and I think in this presentation that we're going to do, is really broken down and built up this puzzle piece that we're going to be looking at and laying down a foundation so that in approaching the book of Revelation, I think all of us are going to have not only a better understanding of the book, but I think it'll be less intimidating, and it will provide confidence moving forward in not only understanding, but trying to teach others what this book is all about and what things mean when you come to various passages and chapters in the book of Revelation. Mark, I really appreciate you joining me today, and glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark, you take unique perspectives on a lot of books that have been very helpful for me. I've learned a lot in the teachings, the classes that you've had. But this one probably is probably one of my favorites that you've done. And so I'm really looking forward to you going through this and laying down this foundation, because I think it is vital, and I think it will help everyone who is willing to look at this book and try to find out what it means.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I want to tell you, it's probably one of my favorites too. And I also just want to say that it's not due to any great intelligence on my part, but it was just curiosity. When I first read the book of Revelation, um, I- it was very confusing to me, and I had no idea really where to go with it. But I knew that there were lots of different interpretations of it, and that it was confusing for a lot of people, and so people kind of avoided it. And I thought that was kind of a pity,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's one of our books. I mean, we
Yeah.
need this book. It was preserved for us for a reason. And so all really, that this is a kind of a product of just a lot of thought and Bible study, and using a couple of principles. One of the principles is, whenever possible, you want to let the Bible be its own commentator. And the the truth of the matter is, the book of Revelation has tremendous amount of commentating going on in the Bible. And so it's actually you use the word puzzle earlier, and that's exactly kind of what this is like. The book of Revelation is like a puzzle that has a bunch of pieces, and almost all of those pieces are found elsewhere in the Bible. We kind of started this class as a look at the book of Revelation from the perspective of, how is it related to all of the Old Testament references that we find there. And as I began to put this class together, I just kept looking and kept looking, and my list of Old Testament references grew. I knew there were some key references that were important to understanding the message of the book of Revelation, but I did not realize how many references there are. I think I counted, and someone might get a different number than me, but I counted 232, I think was the number I came up with, of Old Testament references found in the book of Revelation. That averages, around 11 per chapter. That's a lot of references to the Old Testament, right, found in that book. And so it that helped me to realize that if we understand, I believe this is true, if we understand what the references mean in the Old Testament, well, then we'll understand what they mean in the book of Revelation. So that is super key. That way, the Bible is its own best commentator because you're looking at what these symbols and these references meant in the Old Testament, so you can apply it now to your understanding of the book of Revelation. So that is really key. I think people will see that as we go through.
Yeah, I mean, that's there's gotta be significance, especially using, over 230 references.
Yeah,
There obviously, God sees the significance in it, and so we ought to as well.
exactly. So so that was the main emphasis of doing this. So what we've done for this little discussion, we've kind of just put some slides together that help us look at the main principles that we use to help us understand the book of Revelation. So I'll just go through these slides and we can kind of just discuss these. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail. That's a huge class, obviously, right? But we're going to go through in two podcasts. We're going to go through two sets of key principles. This first time, we're going to look at these 5 key principles that I've got up here on the slide.
Yeah, and real quick, let me mention it, and in case those are listening on the podcast, you can go to the YouTube channel, uh, um, Gospel Preaching with Chris Peltz, and you can see the slides that are being presented as well. And so, while we'll go through this, and I'm sure you'll give plenty of explanation, I do want to let folks know if you're listening on a podcast to these 2-part series, that you can go to Gospel Preaching with Chris Peltz, and you'll be able to see the slides that are being talked about as well.
Right. So the first of the key principles, number 1, is symbols used in Revelation are familiar to God's people because they come from the Old Testament and sometimes elsewhere in the New Testament. So there are not only references to the Old Testament, but also to the New Testament. But I was pretty well focusing on the ones found in the Old Testament. But symbols are used in Revelation, but they would be familiar to the people receiving this revelation at the end of the first century. Okay. So that's kind of a key. And so that's why slides visually are kind of a helpful thing because the book of Revelation is a very visual book. It's all about symbols and images that are presented to John to communicate this message that God had for his people at the end of the first century. So the first of the key principles is this one, that the symbols used in Revelation are familiar. There are so many examples of the symbols that are used that come from the pages of the Old Testament. So number 2, God uses repetition throughout the Bible. Number 3, the message of Revelation exactly follows God's pattern that he set up in Revelation chapter 1, verse 19, when John was told to write these 3 things. Write what you have seen, the things which are, and the things which shall follow hereafter. That the book of Revelation is organized so that that's exactly what John does. He writes down those 3 things, but uh, they're repeated. So number 2, God uses repetition, is combined with number 3, in that it's following this pattern of the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will follow hereafter. But it's repeated at least 3 times in the book of Revelation. So repetition is very important, and the message is God is showing his knowledge of what has been experienced by these Christians in the past, what they are experiencing now in the present, meaning in the first century, the end of the first century, and then what he is about to do in response to the events that these Christians were experiencing. So we'll keep that in mind. Number 4, the 4th key principle is Revelation presents multiple scenes that repeat God's communication of his message from different perspectives. So that's just kind of another way of saying what we just said. And number 5, Revelation's message is immensely relevant to first century persecuted Christians. So when we try to find the meaning of the symbols and images in the book of Revelation and the message there, we must be sure that we interpret those things in such a way that we recognize that it's relevant to those first century Christians. In other words, there's so many interpretations of the book of Revelation that kind of are predicting things that are going to happen even in our future, sometime in our future. But this message was predominantly, probably 99%. I mean, there is obviously some message about what's going to happen in our future, even today. But I would say 99% of this message is it, just super relevant to the first century Christians that were undergoing this terrible persecution. So this next slide is just some illustrations of that first key principle. That symbols used in Revelation are familiar to God's people. They come from the Old Testament and sometimes elsewhere in the New Testament. So I've just got a list here. It's kind of a busy slide, but you see in the book of Revelation, there are lots of symbols. Even there are symbolic objects like fire. I've got on that first line there, fire, clouds, water, a rainbow. These are all God associated symbols, and you see them frequently in the book of Revelation, and you see them in the Old Testament, and we recognize these are like identifying symbols that are used to describe some of the images that John has shown. And we recognize who they're talking about because we see from the Old Testament that those things are associated with God very frequently in the Old Testament. The next line is colors. Different colors mean different things. Red, often symbolizes sin. White, purity. Black, sin again and evil. Purple, royalty. So colors meant something in a symbolic form, from the Old Testament writings. And then there were numbers. The last thing I have listed there is numbers had a meaning. And so we're going to see that numbers in the book of Revelation are used frequently, but they're not just arbitrary numbers chosen. They're numbers kind of lifted from the pages of the Old Testament that have significance. And so you see the list there, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 10, 12, and 40 are the ones I have listed. You might think of others. But those are the kinds of things to remember. And sometimes multiples of those numbers are used in order to signify something. For example, the number 12, Bible readers understand that there are 12 apostles and then there are 12 sons of Jacob. And that's significant. And so the number 12 often refers to something that refers to the people of God in some sense. And in the book of Revelation, we see both of them used. And sometimes we see multiples of them. 12 times 12 is 144. So we see multiples of those numbers, and they all contain a symbolic meaning. So if we just understand that, it helps us to know that we don't have to look for an exact number of things, because these numbers are, when 144, for example, is listed in the book of Revelation, we know that's not an exact number. It's a symbolic number, and it has reference to the people of God. So if we just understand that will be helpful.
Yeah, and Mark, when you look at all these things that you're laying out, this isn't just your guess of how this book is laid out, right? I mean,
Right.
the very first chapter points out that, this is, first of all, it's written in signs and symbols, and it's very specific, not only, what you see, the things that are and the things that will be, but also that will shortly come to pass. I mean, so
Yeah.
there are some very specific instruction given to John about the things that are going to be written that, need to always be kept in mind as well.
Yeah. And it's Revelation 1, verse 19 is a short little verse. And it's easy with the Bible is sometimes very understated. And you can read over things quickly and move on and not really recognize what you read. But Revelation chapter 1, verse 19 is a short little verse that basically sets the stage for the entire book, as Chris has just said. So it's clear, that that when you read through the book of Revelation and keeping Revelation 1:19 in mind, it becomes clear what you're reading. You're reading a repeated um, account, so to speak, of the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will shortly come to pass. But you might just be, you say, well, I already read that sequence, but just using different symbols. That's right. Because but that's exactly what God has done. He's told John what to write, and he is giving him repeatedly the same kind of sequence in order to write. He just uses different symbols, but within those repeated um, sequences. So good point. I've just got some slides up here that are just pictures of that have been drawn by young people, some young people that were taking this class earlier, and um, just to illustrate that this book is an extremely visual book. So John was shown these visions, right? And he was shown things. He was to write what he saw, right? So that's what he was. It was like it was like a giant stage that where the set changed periodically, but there were some sets that were kind of key sets that kept appearing, and the characters on that set kept appearing. So here's one of the sets that you see in Revelation chapter 4, the throne scene in heaven. And you see the throne, and you see the four beasts around the throne, which we learned from the Old Testament are called cherubim. Ezekiel saw that in Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10. There are 24 elders sitting around the throne. Notice that's 12 plus 12. And that's a significant number, right, of elders around the throne. And then there's the lightning and the rainbow and the cloud and all of that. So all of these symbolic things are in this scene, and it's helpful to just remember that. And we'll see that the one sitting on the throne, which is like the Father, is holding a book there, or a scroll with 7 seals, kind of a little magnified or close-up shot of that. And so this all plays a part later in the uh, in the book, chapters 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, actually. So here's the white horse and the white rider. Here's the red horse and the rider. Here's the black horse and the rider. All these colors have significance, right? And then here's the pale horse with death and Hades following behind. And then there's the dragon. Again, Old Testament reference, a serpent of old, right? And is even named in the book of Revelation as Satan and the devil. And he's red. So that color red is very significant in the book of Revelation. And here's point number 2. God uses repetition throughout the Bible. So what's listed here is kind of another busy slide, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I think, examples of how God uses repetition in the Bible to communicate. And it's not just a sort of a haphazard thing. It's kind of a dominant tool that he uses when it comes to teaching or presenting his information to people. So I've just got listed here some examples of repetition that, I mean, my favorite is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That there's the life of Jesus and, teaching of Jesus primarily in his ministry, but in 4 different forms, kind of coming from 4 different perspectives. It's the way God often, communicates his message is with repetition. Well, this happens in the book of Revelation also. We've already mentioned that sequence of you write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will come hereafter. That sequence is repeated at least 3 times, and so we'll see that clearly. And as we go through, God, here's a slide just kind of mentioning that God repeats the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter at least 3 times in Revelation. And so 3 times in Revelation, God shows John this is what those things are that he's showing using different images. The first thing, the things which you have seen, is the glorious success of the gospel. All John's contemporaries have witnessed the success of the spreading of the gospel, but it was accompanied by persecution always, you know. But that's the things which you have seen. The things which are is that persecution has intensified and has now become such that it is threatening the extermination of God's people. Those are the things that are, and then the things that will come to pass shortly, or the things which shall be hereafter, are the things is God's response, what He's going to do, because that's we're going to see in just a moment. That's one of the main reasons why the letter is given. God is giving a response. He's letting His people know what His response is going to be to this terrible persecution that they're going through. So here's another slide that just kind of diagrammatically lists the three sequences that I've found. Each one of these, the first one starting with the seals, the opening of the seven seals and the seven trumpets that follow. That's the first time that this idea of write what you have seen, that those things which are and the things which will come hereafter. That's the first time it's done using those seals and the trumpets. The second time is in chapter 11 of Revelation, where the two witnesses are discussed, and the same sequence is seen there. And the third sequence, which is kind of the bulk of the book of Revelation, begins in chapter 12, and it ends really in chapter 19, in which we see the woman who is getting ready to give birth to the child, and the dragon is ready to devour the child, but the child gets caught up to heaven, and therefore the dragon then turns his attention to the other offspring of the woman, the Christians, really, right? And that explains why this persecution is happening and what God is going to do about it. So again, the third time that sequence is seen. And then so here's the message of Revelation exactly follows God's pattern. So I'm just kind of repeating that here.
Well, that's what God did, so that's what.
That's right. That's right. He used
That's
repetition.
what's helpful. Yeah, that's right.
And we
repetition.
do that
That's right.
today. You know, our
Absolutely.
teaching, we still use that, right?
Repetition, repetition, repetition.
And
right?
here's another And here's another kind of diagram showing those things. So that the things which you have seen at the top there on the left side, the things which you have seen, it involve the spread of the gospel. It's rapid and extensive, and then there's persecution following that, which that's what all the Christians in the first century have probably experienced that. Right. Those are the things which you have seen. The things which are is now you're in the middle of an intensified persecution, and the death toll among Christians is very high. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 24, verses 21 and 22, where he talked about a persecution a tribulation that's going to be such as has never been seen before, right? And so that's the situation that the Christians find themselves in when they receive this letter. And then the things which shall be is God's response. This is the thing they haven't seen. The Christians of the first century have not seen that, but God is letting them in on this information, telling them what He's going to do, that He does have a response for this, and it's not going to last forever. So that's just kind of an outline of that sequence.
Yeah, Mark, when you talk about that three-part sequence that he goes through, again, it builds upon, and you see kind of this as you traverse through the book of Revelation, kind of these three perspectives of the account that John is writing and what is taking place. While technically, you're right, the unsealing of the seals, right, would be the first go around in that three-part. But and this kind of goes away from the slide aspect, what you're doing now, but doesn't he kind of use that even when writing to the churches of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, the 7 churches of Asia,
Yes.
in
Yeah.
in some way?
Yes. I mean, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because that whole idea, what John was told to do was to write these things, right? The things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be. And it, as Chris has said, each time a church is addressed in chapters 2 and 3, that's what God does. He shows them, he shows each church that he knows what they've been through. He gives them details about what they've been through. He knows where they are now. He knows about their suffering now. He mentions that in detail. And then he also will kind of say, but this is what you need to do for the future, right?
Yeah.
So it's like it's following that very same pattern, like you say, Chris, even in those letters, in each individual letter. It's a good point. Yeah. So if we go on, let's see, Revelation presents these multiple scenes that repeat God's communication of his message from different perspectives. And that's one thing I thought you were going to bring up too, Chris, is that each of them is communicating a little different perspective. It's kind of
Right.
like the Gospels, like the Gospel of John is very different from the rest of the gospel because it brings a little different perspective. And I've heard people say in Matthew's gospel is kind of addressing, Jews, giving them Old Testament proofs that, what Jesus did were like fulfillments of prophecy. So each of the gospels kind of has its own perspective. Well, so too, each of these repeated sequences that follow Revelation 1:19, each of them has its own purpose. And one perspective provides a lot more detail about a certain thing than the other perspectives, and so you get a little bit more information each time the sequence is repeated.
Yeah, and that again, that's where that kind of putting that puzzle together, you start with the framework, right? You get the borders around you, you understand,
Right.
not to go outside of these lines, and then you start putting the pieces together. You really see what God is teaching, what He's bringing forth, and revealing to them, in each of these instances, each of these visions that John is having.
Right. Good point. So here, the last one, this is a key point here. It is important to recognize this repeat. So here's a really big key point, right? It's important to recognize this repeating pattern depicted in 3 different scenes in the book of Revelation. And that was one of the things that was very confusing to me because when I first read the book of Revelation as a young Christian, I thought everything was going to happen in consecutive order, like chronological order. But if you don't recognize God's repetition here, but he's just telling the same story in different ways, uh, then you'll really be confused because you'll be trying to figure out, well, okay, well, when did that happen? And then, so this had to happen. What, and so that's why there are a lot of interpretations of the book of Revelation that are kind of going down all kinds of rabbit trails because I don't think everybody recognizes that this pattern exists. And so if you just recognize the pattern, then it helps you stay grounded, so to speak. Like, okay, this is what we're talking about. We're not moving on to the next thing that's going to happen. It's kind of like watching a movie and then they kind of flash back to the past. It's they're not really, it's not really what you're seeing next is not supposed to be added on in chronological order to the future of what you just saw in that movie. It's going back to the past. So that's kind of what's happening in the book of Revelation.
And that's not a new way of approaching
No,
this. And
no,
because God did that, Jeremiah, for example, you can't read through Jeremiah and think all of this is sequential because it's a
right,
series of sermons that Jeremiah gave that is put together that, you may be reading one that took place 15 years into his preaching. And then as you keep going a few chapters later, it's 5 to 10 years into his preaching. And so it's a previous event. And putting that together with what you said earlier on the gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
right,
You don't go through Mark and then that's done. And now you go through Luke, or go through Matthew and then go to Luke. And, they're happening, you know, together, right? What is it being served consecutively, or
Right.
is that how it's
Right. Yeah, chronologically or consecutively. That's
yeah.
right. So that's right. So that I think that's a common error. And another example of that is in Genesis, the first 3 chapters when talks about the creation. There are 2 discussions about the creation of man in Genesis. And so you can see that I know, and I'm sure probably everybody else has probably heard too. There are people who have faulted the Bible and the book of Genesis because there are 2 separate accounts of the creation of man. And so some people will say, well, which is it? Well, the answer is both of them are, but what we're done, God has repeated it in order to show a little different point in the second one than he did in the first. So it's just important to recognize that this is one of the ways that God presents information in his inspired word.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think here, let's see, there's the multiple scenes. I think this is repetition. We've already seen that. Yeah. And then the last point I think that we'd like to just mention, the last key point is that Revelation's message is immensely relevant to first century persecuted Christians. If you're going to read the book of Revelation and try to understand it, you must not think about it in the popular way that it's thought about, and that, oh, it's predicting the future. We're looking for the signs of the times kind of thing. Because I think we're missing the point. We must understand that this letter was written with almost entirely the people of the latter part of the first century in mind. So the revelation of Jesus Christ, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to shew unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John. So this is important to notice that nothing in the book of Revelation is accidental. He said this, things which must shortly come to pass for a reason. This applies to these people that are receiving this letter. And then he says it was signified by his angel unto his servant John, who bear record of the word of God and of the testimony of Jesus Christ and of all things that he saw. So that's what John was doing when he wrote this down. He was bearing record. And then it says, blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand. Now, apparently, I mean, we can really apply this to us even today, right? Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy. We gain something from reading the book of Revelation. It's encouraging to us, and it's good for us to know God's message. But he is specifically sending this to these people. But he says, for the time is at hand. That's what they're getting ready to, he's giving them an answer for a problem that is imminent. So here's some other verses. Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. I, John, who also am your brother and companion in tribulation. That's primarily the reason that this book was written, okay? And why it is applicable to these people at that time. I, John, who also am your brother and companion in tribulation and in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was in the isle that is called Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ. We know that John was in exile, right? Part of that persecution. Verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet, saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. And what thou seest, write in a book and send it unto the 7 churches which are in Asia. And then he names the 7 churches. This was a message that was to go to the churches there because they were in need of this message. So it's just important. It's important to realize that this book, Revelation's message, is relevant to the first century persecuted Christians, not just relevant like it is to us. It is predominantly relevant to those first century persecuted Christians. Okay.
Yeah, very specific to them,
yes.
for sure.
Yes. And so here's another reference from the Old Testament that helps us to say that. Okay. Daniel, the 12th chapter, Daniel predicts this time of tribulation that the first century Christians who received revelation, they were participants in that tribulation. They were contemporaries of it. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 states, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time thy holy people, thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book." And if we, same chapter, if we scoot down to verse 11 in Daniel, it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days." So I want you to see that. That's what Daniel has to say about this tribulation. Okay. And then let's look at what Jesus had to say, because Jesus confirmed Daniel's words in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, when he said, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." And then if we skip down 7 verses to verse 20, or 6 verses to verse 21, it says here that for then Jesus, these are Jesus' words. That's why I've got them in red here for you. "For then shall be great tribulation," talking about a persecution that will follow the destruction of Jerusalem, right? "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." This was no, ordinary persecution. No persecution is ordinary, but this was an extraordinary persecution. And Jesus, he was telling his disciples before he went back to heaven, he was warning them ahead of time. And that's what we're reading about in the book of Revelation. We're reading about the people who are going through that tribulation, and God is telling them, this is why this is happening, and this is what I plan to do about it. What Jesus knew was that when he came to the earth and purposed to give his life as an atoning sacrifice for his people, it was going to deal a terrible death blow to Satan. And so Satan was not happy with that. And Satan was going to do everything he could to stop that. Well, he didn't stop it. Jesus successfully did exactly what he came to do. And so it says in Revelation chapter 12 that Satan fought this battle with Michael and was thrown to the earth, he and his angels, and Satan was very wroth, because he knew his time was short. And therefore he went after the other offspring of the woman who produced the Lord, right? It's not talking about Mary, but this whole plan that God had of bringing the Christ into the world and saving a whole kingdom of people um, through faith in Him.
Mm-hmm.
So there, Jesus was predicting that this was going to happen, and that had to be hard for him to realize that what he was going to do was going to be a wonderful thing for his people. It meant that the doors were thrown open to heaven, but it also meant that there was going to come a time of great tribulation, like has never been experienced and never will be experienced ever again on the earth. And if you go back to Matthew chapter 24 and look at verse 22, just following verse 21, Jesus said that if that time were not cut short, no flesh would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, that time will be cut short. And that's God's message. This is what I'm going to do. I am going to cut this short. And for the sake of the elect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just putting this out, as far as your approach to the book of Revelation, again, we want this to be something that folks can look at and not be so intimidated, understanding how it's written, how it's presented in signs and symbols, the repetition that takes place, that the three aspects of this, what has what they've seen, what John has seen, what is, and what will be, and looking at now the Old Testament references, it really gives us, the and understanding the Old Testament references from Daniel and Ezekiel and others, it it defines what is being talked about, right? And so, moving forward with this understanding, it really is helpful to not be so intimidated by looking at these signs and symbols because they're very familiar to those, especially who are familiar with books like Daniel and others.
Good point. And I think our last couple of slides here are just kind of looking at some main scriptural ideas that are predominantly in the book of Revelation. And these come from other books of the New Testament, but it's the same idea. These the things that we're going to read are messages in the book of Revelation that have been communicated earlier, before the destruction of Jerusalem. Notice there's a letter to the Romans, letter to Timothy, maybe during Paul's, imprisonment, some of these things. But the message is always the same, and it's just kind of intensified the messages in the book of Revelations. Romans 8:18 is the first one there. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. The people in receiving the revelation needed that message. And that was a message given. They were told to stay faithful, be faithful unto death. Revelation 2, verse 10, right?
Yeah.
And 2 Timothy 2:19, nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal. The Lord knoweth them that are his, and let everyone that nameth the name of Christ depart from iniquity. That message is all over in the book of Revelation. So they definitely, and God is always showing them, I know who are mine. And it's like when God decides to judge the beast, for example, he separates out his people almost the way God did in the plagues, where he separated the people of Israel from the Egyptians when he brought the plagues upon the Egyptians. So same message in the book of Revelation. Here's another one, 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. I mean, these people needed to know, is being a Christian worth it? Should I bail out? And the message is no. Stand firm.
Yeah.
Because be unmovable. That yes, it's this persecution is horrible, but God has you, and you will be rewarded. Even if you die, you will be rewarded. 2 Peter 3 verse 11 is the last one I've got here, and that is, seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought ye to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness. Wherefore, beloved, seeing that ye look for such things, be diligent that ye may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless. So I believe, I got one more slide. These are the main questions that are being answered by God in this letter. So really, this is not a haphazard book of the Bible. This is a letter on purpose written by God to answer certain questions that his people have. Their prayers are filled with these questions, right? Revelation 6, verse 10. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? These are the voices of the souls that had been killed for their faith, that were under the altar at the opening of the fifth seal. in Revelation chapter 6? That's the question that they were asking, which kind of echoes the question probably of all Christians at that time, right? How long will you, and God was writing this letter, or giving these visions to John so that he could answer that question. In Revelation 13, verse 4 is another question. When the beast is introduced, whom the dragon will give great power and authority. And it says, and they worship the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? That's a question that God answered too. And his answer is, I'm able to make war with the beast. And there's no comparison. The beast doesn't have a chance, although the beast looks horribly powerful and horribly devastating from an earthly perspective. From God's perspective and the heavenly perspective, the beast is no contest. He's no match. I think that's the last slide, Chris.
Well, Mark, I appreciate you coming on and doing this with me here and going through these slides. And I know it's an extremely condensed version. I mean, you spent several weeks, in our class, and a couple of months, in fact, going through, class on Sunday mornings. But being able to put this together, I think, is important, as anyone who desires to know and understand the book of Revelation. I think they'll get a lot out of not only what you've put forth here, but also in part 2, which is going to be coming up pretty soon as well. So thanks again for coming on and doing this.
Thank you, and I'm really, that is my hope, is that just following some simple little keys, kind of building a little scaffolding on which to build your knowledge of the book of Revelation. It'll just make people, when you read, when people read the book of Revelation on their own, sort of having this background, I think it'll make it a lot easier to follow what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, folks, thanks again for tuning in and listening and watching. Again, if you're listening on a podcast, you can find us at Gospel Preaching with Chris Peltz on YouTube, and you'll be able to see the slides that are being presented as well. But until next time, remember to constantly study the scriptures, just as the Berean spirits did, daily, looking at the Word of God.